The biblical word gospel, evangel, good news, has a very focused overtone. It means a victory announcement. This tells us the battle is over. We are not destroyed. We made it. This good news is decisive. The enemy is undone. Hope is restored. And yet, even as I say this, I feel how far it is from any victory I might hope for in the world today. I can hardly dare to hope that Ukraine will ever get this kind of victory announcement. Or even less, anyone, Palestinian or Israeli, living in the land, in the neighborhood where these resurrection events took place. And even when I think of my own personal fears, my regrets, my failures, even there, I sometimes feel some distance from that hope of a decisive victory announcement. So let's take just a bit of a time out for a quick cultural lesson. Jews believed that God healed the sick. Their scriptures taught them that God could even raise the dead. But it was highly debated at this time as to whether, at the end of time, God would raise people to new life in a new creation. Now, it seems those who had the most invested in worldly power and privilege were the most skeptical of this idea of an end-time resurrection. That would include the Sadducees, the priestly families who earned their living from the temple's organized religion, all the sacrifices and money changing and so on. And they worked hard to stay in Rome's good books. But others, like the Pharisees, said no. They said the prophets do teach the hope of resurrection. A day of the Lord when God sets everything right and welcomes his people back into paradise where we were meant to be. So you had the deniers and you had the end-timers. What you didn't have was anybody who thought that this cosmic, world-changing event, the day of the Lord, could show up in one solitary life on one particular spring day in Jerusalem. To any Jew, that was about as possible as the sun and moon showing up on your front doorstep. So that's why, even though Jesus told his disciples 3 times that he would die and be raised, it was impossible for them to compute. There was total cognitive dissonance. In raising Jesus from the dead, it's like God took a piece of that ultimate future, one discrete quantum of the day of the Lord, and cut and pasted it into the tomb of Jesus on that Sunday morning. The end-of-time reality of eternal, maximal, divine life flooded into that dark cavern, into the body of the Messiah. It was the renewal of all things concentrated with laser-like brilliance in the renewal of the one King. With Jesus' resurrection, the absolute certainty of God's victory announcement erupted unexpectedly, decisively, once and for all, into the heart of this tired old world. That is the good news. That is the gospel. So let's rewind and listen to the story again. When the day of rest was over, the women went out to buy some fragrant medicines so that they could honor Jesus' body with ceremonial anointing. Then, very early, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb. When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had already been rolled away. And as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man to their right, dressed all in white. They were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth. Yes, he was crucified. He was raised to life. He is not here. See, the place where they laid him. But go now, tell his disciples, especially Peter, he's going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." What a message. But what does it mean? What does it mean for the disciples to go back to Galilee? That message carries a number of important overtones that make this a complex invitation. So first of all, Galilee is their home. Right now, they are vulnerable out-of-towners in Jerusalem. They are under suspicion by the temple authorities. A return to Galilee would give them a chance to get out of this place of fear and hypervigilance. Secondly, Galilee is the place of their call. It's where the disciples walked with Jesus, where they learned from him, where they performed miracles alongside him, where they began to be changed by him. And yet, now, all the disciples were dealing with the shame of having denied Jesus in his hour of deepest need. They chickened out. They took off on him. So in this invitation, could it be that Jesus is giving them a second chance, a third chance, 7 times 70? Finally, and thirdly, Galilee represents a new strategy for God's mission of renewal. In the Jewish social and religious pecking order, Jerusalem, and more specifically the temple, was the center of their world. God's holiness was anchored there. It was a monument to God's glory and power. The temple was fenced off from the Gentiles for fear of contamination. But Jesus had promised. It was just a few days earlier, even though it felt like a lifetime ago. Jesus had promised that the temple would be torn down. He declared himself to be the new temple, rebuilt in 3 days. In this, Jesus is saying that holiness doesn't live in a building. It lives in the lives of people. Jesus is saying that the fortress-like centralized power of Jerusalem, let alone the militarized imperial ways of Rome, are not God's way. Rather, it's the power of humble, vulnerable servanthood lived among the people in the homes and markets and fields of Galilee. And then, early on that Sunday morning, resurrection, eternity erupts at the tomb of Jesus. The energetic pace of the story is briefly restored. The empty tomb, the messenger, the invitation to Galilee. And the women, shaking with fear, completely beside themselves, rushed from the tomb without saying anything to anyone, for they were terrified. Terrified and tongue-tied. That is the end of the document. But that is not the end of the story, and Mark knows this. Mark, in giving that sudden, abrupt ending, is throwing the story out to the audience, giving the story to the listeners, handing it over to us. These words of Thomas King ring true for what Mark is doing with his gospel story. It's yours. Do with it what you will. Tell it to your friends. Turn it into a TV movie. Forget it. But don't say in the years to come that you would have lived your life differently if only you had heard this story. You've heard it now.